Well, greetings and salutations, all, and welcome to day 3 of Darwin Digital Days. I'm Chris Beatties, editor of Grower Talks, Green Profit, and the e-newsletter Acres Online, and I'm going to be your host for the next couple of hours, as a matter of fact, as we present all things perennial. Now, granted, being online is not nearly as fun as being out in the gardens at Ball, strolling and chatting and eating lunch under the big tent. And for once, it's not raining in West Chicago. It's picture perfect right now. But hey, this is the next best thing given the circumstances, right? And something that always takes place at Darwin Days is education via expert speakers. So today's event is going to be quite similar to what you'd be doing even if you were at Ball. Before I dive into our speaker introductions, let me remind you that you can enjoy the first 3 days. Oops, there we go. Hang on. There it is. You can enjoy the first 3 days of video content that has already been posted to darwinperennials.com/digital days, the same place you signed up for all of this. You can see new perennial varieties, comparison trials, production tips, consumer insights, a tour of Darwin, Columbia, and you can explore more than 24 supplier tents. I believe that just went live today. And tomorrow, day 4, Thursday, they'll release a deep dive into all things echinacea, or as Chris FIFO pronounces it, echinacea. So that'll be tomorrow. And then lastly, stick around virtually, that is, for Friday, the final day of Darwin Digital Days, where you'll get to have an inside look at the home gardens of the Darwin team members. And I can testify that it's a ton of fun and you'll get a few laughs as well. So, and of course I had all those things on the slides right there, but important on the slide, I do want to thank the Digital Days sponsor, Ball Seed, for making this event possible. And now, on with the show. That means we need some speakers. We've got 2 guest experts lined up for you today. The first is a regular at Darwin Days. He is Mr. Paul Pilon, well known around the country as a top-notch perennial expert and consultant, and the author of one of Ball Publishing's popular e-newsletters, Perennial Pulse, which I think it's right on his sleeve. He wears it on his sleeve. Seen by more than 30,000 subscribers every other week. Welcome, Paul. Good, glad to have you here.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be here. Missed the rain, but beautiful weather, and I'm glad to be part of the program this year.
All right, no rain at all. You'd be out there getting a little bit of a tan, and that would be it. And where are you broadcasting from? Where is home for Paul Pilon?
Beautiful, sunny West Michigan, over by Grand Rapids.
There you go. Well, you're not that far, just a stone's throw across the lake. All right. Well, we're looking forward to your presentation, I guarantee. Up next, Dr. William Garrett Owen, Assistant Extension Professor of Floriculture, Greenhouse, and Controlled Environments at the University of Kentucky. We know him as Garrett, with 1 T, by the way. But Garrett, where are you broadcasting from, my friend?
From my office in Lexington, Kentucky, the Bluegrass State.
There you go. All right. Well, we're happy to have you as well. We've got a little bit of housekeeping. If you have questions, you just put them into the Q&A area. I think you'll find it somewhere on your screen. It says Q&A. Type in the question. I'll address them kind of as we go along. We got a couple of spots built in for that. And of course, we'll save some time at the end. And as always, this webinar will be archived. In this case, it'll be archived at the Darwin Digital Days website. So same place you've gone for all this other good content, darwinperennials.com/digital days. And I think that's all the housekeeping I can possibly do. So Paul, why don't you get set to share your screen and tell us something about perennials. And by the way, during Paul's presentation, we're going to have a little bit of interaction, audience interaction as well. So take it away, Paul.
All right. Thanks again, Chris. It's good to be here remotely in Michigan, presenting to people around the country and potentially across the world. So it's a pleasure and an honor. So thanks again. When Leland from Darwin approached me about presenting at Darwin Perennial Days, when it was actually a real event, in person. We were talking about topics, and there were several good topics that we came up with, but we decided to do kind of a hybrid of two topics, kind of considering where we were at back in, I believe that was probably late February or early March when we kind of ironed out the topics. But we decided to do kind of a two-parter. So the first part I'm going to talk about is how to hold them, and the second part will be recognizing crop problems. And this is kind of a spin-off of the ever so popular What's Happening Here that I do in the Perennial Pulse newsletter quite frequently. So when it comes to holding plants in greenhouses, there's going to be a number of reasons that we are in positions where we have to hold plants. Sometimes the plants might be just growing too fast. This could be a normal year, but they're coming too fast, and you need to kind of put on the brakes just a little bit to be able to make sure they're not past their prime when you reach the shipping date or putting them in the retail garden centers. But the most common reasons we have to hold plants back are due to weather conditions such as cold springs and wet, rainy springs. The consumers just aren't out there at the garden centers and planting plants in their yard the same during adverse conditions as they are during more ambient spring-like weather. How many times have we had weekend after weekend after weekend of bad weather, whether it's wet or rainy? And so, weather still drives a lot of our industry and our sales. And there's times if we can anticipate that plants are coming too fast, or that, we have adverse weather in the horizon, that there's some tools we could do to put on the brakes. And this year we had the unusual event with a coronavirus occurring that, here in Michigan, our garden centers were not allowed to be open for most of the month of April. So there's always unforeseen circumstances. We have sometimes a little bit of ability to see in the future. Other times we do not. So whenever you decide to hold a plant back, we kind of have to, I guess, anticipate the future, because of if we can react sooner with some of the tools I'm going to share with you, we're going to get better results than if you wait to the very end to start taking action to hold the plants back. So with that, the number one tool that any of us can use is using temperature as a growth regulator. Temperature has the greatest effect on plant growth and development for the plant as well as the flowers, more than anything else that we can do. The cooler temperatures not only slows down the rate of plant growth, but it can also be used to improve quality. I like to share with you a couple of examples of how that can be. So in many cases, when we grow cooler, you'll see that the plants are a little bit shorter, more compact, a little bit denser, sturdy plants, really nice. But some other attributes I wanted to point out is some of it came from some work that Michigan State University did, and I've seen it firsthand, and maybe some of you have too. The flower size, when you grow cooler, the flower size will be larger than it will be if you grow under warmer conditions. Like a Coreopsis flower will be typically about twice the size at 80 degrees is what it would be at 60 degrees. In addition to that, the flower colors are a little bit more intense. So it'll be a crisper, brighter blue at cooler temperatures than what it would be if it's warm. And then we'll also have a little bit better branching. So we'll end up with more flowers per plant when we can grow cooler. And then when we grow cooler, since we're growing that more compact plant anyway, we're going to decrease our necessity for the PGRs. And I'll talk a little bit about PGRs coming up. And then depends on where you live and the time of the year it is. If you have to heat with heaters and spend a lot of BTUs on energy, if we can grow cooler, you'll save money on energy bills. So just how low can we go with temperatures? Well, that really depends on the type of plants that we're growing. And I'm kind of splitting this up to keep it very simple into a couple groups. I'm going to call them the cold tolerant perennials. And these are perennials, let's say, that are maybe zone 8 or colder. So zone 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. These are plants that can tolerate some cold temperatures. So we can grow these, or we can hold these at temperatures as low as 40 degrees. And then another group of plants are going to be more of your tropical plants, your zone 9, 10, and 11. Some of the items that would be tropical perennials, or definitely not a perennial here in Michigan, but could be a perennial down in Florida. These plants tend to not tolerate cold quite so well. So if we need to hold them, we have to make sure the temperatures don't go down to 40 degrees or even colder. So we're going to want to maintain more like a 50 to 55 degree Fahrenheit. Um, in general, for most perennials, I'm going to say 40 to 45 to 50 degrees is kind of a nice holding pattern. These aren't necessarily temperatures that you're going to be growing the plants at per se, but these would be holding temperatures that would buy you days or a week or maybe even 2 weeks if you're in a position where you have to hold them in the greenhouses. I don't have the crystal ball on what the future is going to be like. The growers I worked with this year, that we recognized that due to the virus that was going to be a late spring, we made some changes very early on. I received several positive feedback and comments about how the crops looked different to them. They like the quality, they like the appearance of the plants. And so many of these growers are planning on growing these crops cooler next year. And doesn't mean we're going to grow at that 40-degree mark, but they're going to grow them cooler to build a little bit different plant than they're used to based on some of the things they saw this spring. One of the strategies, when doing so, is that you still want that plant to get established. So I'd recommend, maybe allowing 2 weeks at maybe 60, 65 degrees to get some roots established, roots to the edge of the pot, get a little bit of growth started on the top. And then for the remainder of the crop, then we can grow them cooler, maybe 5 to 10 or maybe 15 degrees cooler to finish them off. Somewhere in the 50 to 55 degree range would kind of be a good spot to be, where we'll still get growth without I guess stalling them out too severely. And then when we're doing this, you'll find that it will increase your production time. And I'm going to anticipate, in this scenario that I pointed out, that you'll see the plants will be about 7 to 10, possibly even 14 days later than what you've experienced when you grow them at warmer temperatures. If you're looking for kind of a rule of thumb of how much time is it going to add on, I found it pretty reliable to use. I don't know if it's a gardener's rule of thumb or a greenhouse grower's rule of thumb, but generally speaking, for about every 5-degree temperature Fahrenheit that you drop your temperature, you're going to add about a week of production time. So if you go from 65 down to 60, that's going to add about 1 week of production time. If you go from 65 down to 55, you're going to add about 2 weeks of total crop time onto that crop. Again, every plant's different. I don't know if we fully know every perennial that's out there, how much additional time it would be, but this would be kind of a good guideline. And that rule of thumb applies from the beginning of the crop to the end of the crop. So if we go 6 weeks of, let's say we have a 9-week crop and we grow the first 6 weeks at the normal temperatures, then we want to drop it 5 degrees. You're not going to add that full week of additional production time because you're only doing it for like a 2 or 3 week window to the tail end of the crop. So in that scenario, we're only adding, a day, maybe 2 days or so on to its total production time. Besides temperature, another tool we can use is to reduce our fertilizer rates. When we grow cooler, we don't have the type of growth, and that plant's not transpiring the same. It's not taking up the nutrients, expanding the leaves, so we don't need to keep pumping the fertilizer to it the same way we would normally do. So if you're using a liquid fertilization program, we can reduce the fertilizer rates by about 50%, somewhere in the tune of, delivering about 50 to 75 part per million nitrogen using a good, well-balanced fertilizer. This will provide a good baseline to sustain the plant growth that's there and prevent chlorosis and other nutrient from developing. Drop your nitrogen, the total amount of fertilizer you're delivering by about 50%, and this applies to the EC. So if we were delivering, an EC of 1.1, we're going to drop that by about 50%, and now we're going to provide an EC of about 0.55. The pH is going to remain the same. pH doesn't quite work that same. So if you're targeting a 6.0, you're still going to want to maintain a 6.0 because we can still get some nutrient availability issues one way or the other if our pH gets out of whack. So I already mentioned, to use a balanced formulation. I prefer to use one with micronutrients when we're growing, trying to hold plants and keep them to the finish line. I find it's best to use nitrate nitrogen sources like a calcium nitrate or a potassium nitrate or a combination product. Avoid using ammoniacal sources. Ammonium nitrate causes a certain type of soft growth and you get some leaf expansion that could be not what you're desiring during the holding pattern. If you have to use a formulation that has some ammoniacal nitrogen in it, aim for a formulation that has 20% or less. Less is better in this case. Other elements we're going to want to be cognizant of known to provide a little bit of soft growth and expansion. So in a normal situation, we're delivering, the plant can only use about 10 to 12 part per million phos. So we want to cut that about in half. So I'm proposing 5, maybe 6 part per million when you're in the holding pattern should be perfectly adequate. Now phosphorus is one of those elements that at cool temperatures below 60 degrees, it's not taken up by the plants as readily. So the longer your holding pattern, maybe the more your chances of having some phosphorus deficiencies. But if you don't remove it altogether and still provide about 5-6 part per million, you should be able to get through that period of time. And if the plants do turn off color, and by off color I'm trying to describe just general chlorosis, we can always apply 1 or 2 higher rate liquid fertilizations, maybe 150 part per million as needed to help you maintain that color. Now, PGRs are also effective tools we can use to hold plants. And I know we usually think of plant growth regulators as a height reduction tool to I guess I always say build a plant of the desired shape and size. But I also find that they could be quite effective at slowing not the rate of growth, that's the function of temperature, but the type of growth, so that it doesn't quite fill up the pot as fast. And then I've seen a great ability to help growers hold plants in the greenhouses when they're used during production. And this can be when we have adverse weekends, the adverse weather conditions. The benefit, you have to hold them in your greenhouse until the stores will take the plants. And also plants treated with growth regulators will have a longer shelf life at the retail settings. So there's some real benefits from using plant growth regulators, and I'm a real big fan of using PGRs on perennials. They are especially, plant growth regulators are especially effective when you're using other strategies. For example, if you're growing at cool temperatures, or you're using a negative diff where the day temperatures are less than your night temperatures, or you're doing a drop in the morning, a cool temperature drop in the morning. And if you use plant growth regulators in combination with some of these other strategies, what you'll see is you'll get an enhanced PGR effect. It'll make your plant growth regulator work a little bit easier, and you get a little bit more response. That goes up to a certain point, because if it's if you are truly at 40 degrees and it's a constant 40 degrees and there's not much growth, you put the plant growth regulator on, you're likely not to see, I guess, the full benefit that I'm describing. So how can we use plant growth regulators to hold the plants? And I guess I find that it's better to use them during the active growth phase and to apply lower rates multiple times during production, as opposed to wait to the tail end of the crop and say, oh my gosh, the plants are too tall and I need to do something now. If you look at this picture of the polemonium on your screen, the plant on the left the tray on the left was not treated with PGRs, and the tray on the right was. And I don't want to spoon feed what you're thinking or what you're seeing, but the plant on the left, it's a little bit scrawnier. The growth is thinner. It's lighter green, and I would dare gamble that the plant on the left is not going to have as long as a shelf life as that darker, more compact plant on the right. So again, we can increase our shelf life. One of the things I want to keep in mind, I hear growers wanting to grow the plant and then they just want to stop it in its tracks. Well, one of the dangers in that is we got to make sure we're not using plant growth regulators to the point where we get residual in the landscape. So realistically, we want to use them, and we want to be able to maintain that benefit, whether it's a height reduction benefit or to remain in this holding pattern that you're in for about 2 to 3 weeks without having persistent residual control in the landscape. The last thing we want is to buy a plant and it just sits there. I've personally purchased plants of impatiens and other things that they look great in the plug tray or the cell flat when I bought them at the store, or got them from a grower, but I put them in the landscape and they just sat there all summer long and didn't grow. And that's not That's not how we want our product to look and perform for our customers. So with PGRs, I'd like to talk about sprays and drenches just a little bit. I put together this table, again, kind of dividing plants into different categories. I have the PGR sensitive group. I have kind of plants that have an average growth rate, and then I'm going to say your aggressive growers. So as you can imagine, as you go from a sensitive plant all the way up to an aggressive grower, that the amount of growth regulator needed is going to change dramatically based on its growth rate. I've listed a few active ingredients here. There certainly are other products that are available that are also effective as the tools or the products I've mentioned here. These are what I see perennial growers using the most, and these are some of my favorites. So if you've never tried the combination of the diminizide and uniconazole, that's a very, very good combination. It kind of gives you kind of the efficacy of the uniconazole with the plant safety of the diminizide. It'll broaden the number of plants that you can apply that on. And again, I have typically 2 rates that I'm using. My average growers get 1 rate, and the more aggressive growers get another rate. Keep in mind that the rates listed on the table they're not for demonstration purposes. That's not my disclaimer. The rates on the table are beginning points. These would be, regardless of where you live, these are going to be your early season rates, north or south. But what you're going to find is as the season progresses, you're going to have to use high rates. And I know we typically say the southern rates are always higher than the northern rates. When I managed 2 facilities, one in the south and one in the north, I found that I could use the same rate for a certain period of time, but I would have to increase my rates at the southern location much faster than I would in the north. And we're talking, you know, you'll step it up. You might increase by 25% increments, and in some cases you may even have to double the rate that you were using in the early spring. So again, these are kind of demonstrational purposes or informational purposes only, and these are also intended to be used for multiple applications that I mentioned earlier, the lower rate multiple applications. And this is not intended to be applied to a plant with the hope that that plant's never going to grow until it's sold, and then it's going to eventually do its thing for the customer. So I did the same thing with the PGRs for the drenches. Kind of came up with the 2 most commonly used drench products, the paclobutrazole and uniconazole, and that should actually have in the table. I apologize for that. In the table, it should have aggressive, sensitive, and so on and so forth on that chart. But so the one thing to be aware of is if your growing mix contains bark, we're going to have to increase the rate compared to peat-based mixes. Some of the PGR active ingredient gets tied up into the bark and is not available for the roots to uptake and to get the benefit. So what we'll see here is that in a peat mix, we might use 3 to 5 part per million. And then when we go to a bark mix, the range is going to be somewhere between 6 to 10 part per million. Some plants it might even be higher, but this is kind of an example of when you're shifting from, if you hear a rate that was done in a peat mix, what would that mean for you in a bark mix? And then in wood fiber, the rates really could be about the same as what they are for the peat moss mixes. Regardless of the type of mix, it's beneficial to moisten the media before applying a drench. This helps it move through the soil profile more effectively rather than getting some channeling down the sides of the pot. And these rates are also intended for the low volume or dosage drenches that you'll see on the product labels. An example of that would be like 4 ounces of drench solution per 6-ounce container. If you're going to use a higher volume, such like if you're going to do a watered in method, you would need to decrease your rates than those listed on the table. And another rule of thumb I find, if you're accustomed to using spray rates, but you want to consider using some drenches, what I find is that drench rates are about 1/6 of the rate I would use for sprays. So for example, with the paclobutrazole, if I would spray the plant with 30 part per million, and you take about 1/6 of that, so you're down to that 5 or 6 part per million range. So that will work for the uniconazole as well. So those aren't absolutes, and again, every plant's a little bit different. But if you're looking for a starting point, reduce by 1/5 or 1/6 of what you would spray with, and that would be your go-to drench rate to begin with. There's a few other considerations with holding perennials back, and one of them is that you could grow drier. I guess a word of warning is, even if it's cooler, plants do wilt, and you can get excessive and maybe even permanent damage with excessive wilting. So use moisture as a growth regulator or as a holding back tool, but don't, avoid going too far with it. Once you have a canopy, it's very important that you provide good air movement using air circulation fans, horizontal airflow fans. And also, once you have a canopy, we get the kind of like a microenvironment under the canopy where humidity tends to be higher than it is in the air. And so it's important, to have good air movement through there to move the humidity away from the plant, as well as to purge the greenhouse and get that excessive moisture out of the air. Because with high humidity, we're going to see softer growth, we're going to see condensation, we're going to see more diseases like botrytis and other problems come in. And then you also, again, affect the type of growth. So, and then during these holding patterns, it's often advisable to use a preventative fungicide application just to kind of keep things at bay, because we're not in our normal growing conditions. And so using preventative fungicides on occasion during holding pattern can be a good tool. And then not a lot of us have this option in the spring, but if space is available, space is a great tool. It keeps the plants from becoming stovepiped and growing vertically, and just kind of keeps those microenvironments with a high humidity from building up. So these are some of the common tools. And I guess, Chris, if I can ask you if there was any questions that came in so far before I move on to the second part of the presentation. So Chris, are you with me?
I am with you. No questions right now. So take it on to part 2, Paul.
Okay. In the second part, we wanted to, Leland and I talked about putting together, maybe a fun, interactive, we were trying to think of ideas on how we could relive what's happening here from the perennial pulse. So came up with the idea of, doing some interactive polls, where Chris will send out some, I'll show some pictures and Chris will send out some scenarios for you to pick the answers. Chris and I have never done this before, so we're hoping that it's something that's fun. That, none of the issues I'm showing are going to be too complicated. But yeah, let's dive into this, and I'll go over a couple things before I have our first official poll. Whenever we have problems in the greenhouse, it's always helpful if we can identify what type of problem it is. If we have a leaf spot, but we think it's a chemical phytotoxicity, we might not put a fungicide on, and the leaf spot pathogen is just going to keep progressing and becoming worse and worse over time. So there's many, this is a whole presentation in itself that we can't possibly do in 20 minutes, but I want to emphasize that it's important that we get proper identification, and some of that's going to come through experience, some of that's going to come from just kind of observing the environment around you. And I'm going to, in our examples, I'll try to kind of give you some I guess tips on where to look and what to look for as we go through. But just imagine there's tons of things that can go on with our crops. I mean, they're living organisms. They're, I guess, perishable, if you want to call them that. So we have to fight all the living and the biotic problems that we can get with bacteria, fungi, insects. But we also have to deal with a lot of other issues like fertility and air pollutants and drought or even frost. I wasn't that long ago I was getting phone calls on how to protect plants from frost. Right in the middle of a shipping season. So, so if we know what we're looking at, what the damage is from, we can know how to make adjustments in the near term for the current crops, but also to kind of be cognizant of how to design the future production cycle to avoid or implement prevention, so small problems don't become big ones over time. So Chris, if you would send out the first poll that I have, I wanted to ask some questions on signs versus symptoms. We hear these words, and I think many of us, maybe they're used interchangeably. And in the end, I don't know if, if you're a pathologist or entomologist, you'll probably kick me right now for saying this. I don't know if in the end it matters if, it's a sign versus a symptom, but these can be helpful terminologies when we, are trying to diagnose a problem. And whether you send me a description or a pathologist a description of a problem. So Chris is going to have that on for about 30 seconds or so, and then he'll end the poll and we'll see. So I thought I could start talking about what these are. Symptoms are basically visible abnormalities on the plant. It's going to be deformed leaves, discoloration, gall development, anything that's physically visible on the plant. So Chris, why don't you go ahead and show the results if you have them? I thought this would be interesting to see if everybody nailed it or not. So we have 44, 32. Okay, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. It seems like there's some confusion, but that's okay. All right. So I'll move on. So the chlorosis I showed on the Alcea leaf, that is a symptom because it's a physical, it's affecting the physical appearance of the plant itself. And where signs are actual parts of a pathogen, like the spore structures, mycelium, pustules. It might even be for insects. It's going to be egg masses or frass or doo-doo. Exoskeletons like whiteflies or aphids. So it's going to be, signs are going to be actual parts of the pathogen, and symptoms are going to be, the plant's actual visible response or abnormality to the situation. So if you answered B, that the image on the right, which was the chlorosis, is a symptom, and the image on the left is a sign, you nailed it. And I guess, as I say on occasion, you earned a gold star. So here's your virtual stars. Sorry I couldn't be there in person, or you couldn't be there in person to do that this year. So as we look at how to diagnose plants, I guess there's experience, trumps everything, right? But understand what looks normal for the plant. Sometimes we'll get like a ligularia, like leopard's bane, that has like the little yellow spots, and somebody will say, oh, I have a problem with that. Well, those yellow spots are normal for that plant. Sometimes variegation could get confused for, maybe an herbicide injury or something of that nature. So, if you know what the plant's supposed to look like, that's very helpful in determining if you have a problem to begin with. Yes, that's supposed to have yellow foliage, stuff like that. Look for anything abnormal. I'm going to say, the signs and the symptoms that I just quizzed you on, but anything abnormal, what's unusual, what's out of place. And, then you have to ask yourself a series of questions. When did it appear? Did they develop overnight? Did they develop over time? Did it coincidentally happen like, within a day or 2 days of making a spray application of something? Look at the crop itself. Are there random patches? If that's what you're seeing, it's probably more of an insect or a disease kind of sporadic through the greenhouse. It might be more prevalent by a door or a vent, but then kind of work its way in. Or is it, is it the entire crop? Meaning like, oh, I sprayed the whole crop, or, due to the environment, it all got frost and all the hostas just like literally like got translucent and collapsed. So these are indications for what types of problems we're dealing at. And of course, in 20 minutes, we can't possibly cover all the aspects of scouting and diagnosing things. But also, we as growers often cause some of the problems that we experience. And it takes a lot to admit that, we are the cause of some of the problems that our teams face when we're growing plants, but it's true. Planting dips is a great example of an area that I see where certain crops, especially the ones with the basal foliage, like the Polemonium in this picture, Campanula and Delphinium, the grandiflora delphiniums, they don't like their crowns being buried. A heuchera, Tiarella, for example. And if you plant them too deeply, quite often you kind of get a little bit of a slow death. You get some crop variability. Eventually, you'll get some crown rots. But the crown rot, it's secondary to the proper planting depths. So, if it's planting depths, it's usually too deep. There are a few instances where, I'll see, I laugh at this picture because of, that's nearly 3 inches of root above the soil surface, but I laugh because of this happens. I don't think anybody planted it improperly on purpose, but due to trying to get a certain number of pots done per hour or per day, and maybe only being able to supervise the crews, on occasion, stuff like this happens. So not only do we have, the environmental things, the pathogens and the insects that can affect our crops, we have, ourselves sometimes that can cause some of our crop issues. So let's dive into a couple examples. Here's one. So if you do read perennial pulse, you probably already know the answer, but here's one I ran a few weeks ago on a crop of geraniums that I came across this spring. And as I approached it, you can kind of see that the block is, hey Chris, have you started the poll yet? As you can see, thank you. As you can see, there's kind of flower in the front by the aisle, kind of a patch of green, and then flowers toward the end of the block. And so, there's a number of questions. At first you think, oh, I know the answer, I know what it is, and I'm always going to tell you, you need to take a closer look. This is like the bird's eye view. From afar, it looks this way, but what does it look like when we get closer up? And so I don't know where we are on the time. If you're ready to reveal the answers, that would be awesome. I do have, this is the same crop, just a different angle. So I'm standing right in front of it this time. So again, you can kind of see flowerings nearest the aisle, a green patch toward the middle, and then a little bit of flowering toward the end. So I'm curious to see if, how many, one, if I gave away the answer because I put it in the newsletter, or two, how many got it. All right, so that's probably what I would have thought too, improper watering. So shame on the Perennial Pulse readers for not picking up on that one or showing up for today's event, but that's fine. It is not improper watering. So all those who guessed B, I would have probably done the same thing based on the picture itself. But looking closer at the plant, getting right down and looking into the leaves, the crop was covered with aphids. So the aphids were the cause of the lack of flowers that you see in this plant. So, so I guess, what I wanted to emphasize again was, as an experienced grower or even an unexperienced grower, it's good to have ideas, but you can't just look at a picture or walk by a crop and assume that we know what's going on. Sometimes we have to delve in and really take a closer look to see what's going on. Because of lack of water, I would have changed the water practices, and maybe I would have caused other issues like crown or root rot. And I would not have put an insecticide on to control the aphids. So if I managed improper watering, this problem would continue to progress. And you can see I believe that's I think that's a leucanthemum here in the foreground. But these aphids would then spread to other adjacent crops if they weren't taken care of in this one. So, all right, we have, I think, 2 more polls. Let's kind of move on to this one. This is a fairly common problem, I would say. I see it more in the Midwest or east of the Mississippi than I do in other parts of the country. I don't know if that's, always going to hold true, but year after year, if I talk to somebody in Colorado or Utah, they don't face this issue. But if I'm in other parts of the country, maybe the Pacific Northwest, Midwest, East Coast, there's growers who face this issue almost every year on this. So what you can see is this is the upper leaf surface. We have those angular patches, a little bit off color. And the other thing I always try to do is, I said, get your bird's eye view, take a closer look at the crop, but always turn over the leaves and look at the undersides. Because in this case, what we can see is we get the fuzzy sporangia from a disease is on the undersides of the leaf. So if you answered C, disease, or downy mildew, you win yourself a gold star. So perfect. The majority of those polled as Steve Harvey would say. 57% answered Downy mildew, so that's pretty good. So, Downy mildew develops on a number of perennials. This is one of them. Quite often we see these patches, and directly underneath you'll see the sporangia. I have seen a number of instances where plants have that patch, that they don't have the sporangia. If you see that, it could be other issues like foliar nematodes. But if you know the plant and its history, it's probably downy mildew, and then it's just waiting for the right environmental condition for the sporangia to develop on the underside. All right, I think this is our last official poll. This is a crop of Phlox subulata. A fairly young crop, but old enough to be fully established. What are we putting on here? When I see this, I know where my mind goes, and I want to see if that's where your mind goes. So it's a fairly common problem, but I'm going to say not every grower is going to experience this. Those who do will probably experience it frequently, and other growers might not ever see this issue on a phlox or even on other plants in general, and I can kind of reveal why. So here's just another clue with tipping out the roots. Now this is an adjacent crop of gallons, not the actual square pots that are pictured here, but the symptoms are very similar. You can see the off-color rooting there, where it's light brown, dark brown, white, and maybe even black, and that could be also an indication that that word I just said, black. So let's have you reveal, and then we'll reveal the answer. Root rot, very good. So yes, when you see that yellow discoloration on some plants, but not all the plants, that's usually an indication of, it can be overwatering, but it can also typically be a root or a crown rot. And in this case, it's the Labiopsis. So yes, absolutely, another gold star for all the contenders who answered D. This is the Labiopsis, and when the Labiopsis first starts, it'll look like this, the picture right here by the word Labiopsis to the right, where you kind of have these little black bands. So it'll be black, looks like a healthy root, a black patch, and then healthy root. And as it progresses, those bands kind of grow together, and the roots become more of a brown appearance, and then the entire root system can turn black and almost like a water soaked. It's almost, I'm going to say it's a really cool look if you see black root rot like on a Phlox paniculata and some other plants, and how dark the roots can actually turn. The growers never like to hear me say how cool it is, because obviously that's an indication there's a big problem. In this case, I'm not going to cover a lot of it, but in this case, black root rot or Labiopsis, it's favored by pH. So pH is 6.5, 0.8, maybe, and the host for Labiopsis, it's going to be more prone to getting it. So one of the tools is to manage a media pH. If we can keep the pH about 6.3 or lower, you'll rarely develop Labiopsis. I'm not going to say it won't happen, but it dramatically decreases your chance of Labiopsis developing. So some growers that experience every year, I don't know if it's their lime charge, it could be their water quality that's driving up their pH, a number of things it could be, where other growers who have good control of the pH in the soil would really see this issue. And so if you experience this, work on controlling your pH, and then a good preventative fungicide program would be a good thing to have. So kind of just real quickly summarizing my like really brief overview of crop problems. Look for the symptoms and the signs, anything that looks abnormal. Try to identify patterns, ask questions. But get that overview of the crop, go right in and kind of take a closer look into the canopy, look under the leaves. There's a number of diseases, like rust is another one, where we'll see some abnormalities on the top of the leaf, and under it there'll be the pustule. And look at the root system. I don't know how many growers don't take the time to check out their roots, but this is a very important tidbit for you to do when you're growing plants. So I hope you had fun in this little section with the polls. I don't know, Chris, if this would be something that if everybody liked it, that maybe we could do a little bit more of this in a little bit different format, but you know, it was fun putting together, and the responses, I think everybody nailed it except for the geranium. There was one. So I guess my last message is that growing plants may seem challenging, but there's always worse jobs that you could be doing, right? So with that, Chris, I'd like to hand it back over to you for some Q&A if there's time for that. It looks like I stuck to my promise of being 45 minutes, so right on the
All right,
button.
well, I'll let people kind of grab your email address and phone off of there real quick before we stop sharing. And yeah, we'll go ahead and stop that share now. There's still no key questions coming in. I hope I didn't set something wrong. Are you guys able to ask questions, or is Paul just doing such a fabulous job that you don't have any questions? None have come in yet, which means we'll go right on to Garrett. But if you have any, go ahead and type them in, whether they're for Paul or for Garrett. Andrew just tested it and it works fine. So there we go. Thanks for that. I appreciate it. So the questionnaire is working. Paul, you're just unquestionably, you are a perennial expert. Did you see what I did there? All right. All right. And on that note, let's turn it over to another unquestionably expert, Garrett Owen. And Garrett, we've already introduced you. So with no further ado, go ahead and share your screen and take it away.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Garrett Owen, and I am the Floriculture Extension and Researcher in the Department of Horticulture at the University of Kentucky. And today I'm going to be talking about successfully propagating vegetative perennial cuttings. So I'm going to begin with just a general overview of vegetative cutting and liner production. So the majority of the stock plant facilities are located in Central and South America. And in these locations, if you're not familiar, that these mother plants, the apical meristems, are excised to produce these unrooted shoot tip cuttings. These shoot tip cuttings are then bagged, boxed, and then they are prepared and shipped all the way to the US to be received by greenhouse growers and propagators, where then they are stuck and placed into the propagation environment where they are calloused, rooted, and then toned. And then from there, they can be either transplanted into their final container or they are shipped to be received by the end greenhouse producer. So during propagation, cuttings move through different horticultural and developmental phases. And those horticultural phases are harvest to stick being stage 1, and then calloused all the way to tonings, moving from stages 2 to 4. During this time that the cuttings are callousing and rooting, they undergo different developmental phases that are influenced by different exogenous and endogenous factors. So I'm going to be talking more about the exogenous factors, that being what you see here on the screen, the cultural aspects that you can provide to the cuttings, that being a foliar rooting hormone, mineral nutrition, or the environmental aspects, controlling and manipulating the daily light integral, temperature being air or root zone, misting and irrigation frequencies, and humidity. So for today's presentation, I'm going to be focusing on these 3 key areas, being foliar rooting hormone applications during stick or right after stick, and then daily light integral and root zone temperature, and then the interaction between daily light integral and root zone temperature during herbaceous perennial propagation. So I'm going to first start off with the foliar rooting hormone applications with some recent trials that we had conducted, because I receive a lot of inquiries about, well, do I need to apply rooting hormones to my unrooted cuttings? And my answer is typically, well, not all plants require rooting hormones, especially those that are easy to root, but you may want to consider applying a rooting hormone to those that are moderate to difficult to root, which will help accelerate or hasten root initiation and formation, but it also provides some insurance or allows them to root uniformly within a given period of time. So here's an example of a list that was compiled of herbaceous perennial species that has a low benefit of rooting hormone applications, or those that are quite frequently easy to root, versus those that may benefit from a rooting hormone application or that require a rooting hormone application either as a basal dip or as a foliar rooting hormone application. There are quite a few commercially available rooting hormones available to date, those being either a powder form, talc powder, alcohol, or a water-soluble salt. However, when it comes to applying rooting hormones, I often see in production those that are doing a liquid basal dip or the talc powder, and it is quite labor intensive and time consuming. So if you're not familiar with it already, there is an alternative option, and that is foliar sprays. So foliar sprays, it's not new, but it's something that we're kind of revisiting again in terms of research, or at least I have in terms of research. And these sprays are applied after sticking the cuttings, usually 24 hours after placing the cuttings within the propagation environment, allows them to become turgid. And then when you do apply that foliar rooting hormone, you want to apply it to the point of drip so that the leaf is completely saturated. And again, it's dripping off into almost a substrate. But I do want to point out that the IBA foliar spray applications are often lower than the concentrations required for cutting basal dips. But it's very important to note to always conduct a small in-house trial before applying a chemical of any type for the first time to a crop, just to understand what the responses may be. So for the trial that was conducted this past spring, we investigated 10 different species that are categorized by easy, moderate, and difficult to root. And I used a new rooting hormone by Fine Americas called Advocate, and this was a liquid rooting hormone. So basically, there was no dissolving of any salts, no alcohols whatsoever. It was dose out the concentration, mix it in with water, and apply. So this trial had an untreated control, so 0 parts per million IBA, had a 200 parts per million KIBA from a water-soluble salt, and then increasing concentrations of Advocate from 200 to 1200 parts per million. And again, we're wanting to look at the response of rooting to Advocate and compare the 200 parts per millions of Advocate to KIBA. So the trial was conducted, so received unrooted cuttings, placed them within the propagation environment, and within 24 hours, we sprayed the cuttings to the point of drip at a volume of ½ gallon per 100 square feet. We allowed the cuttings to completely dry before we resumed any misting, and the study was conducted for 21 days. So the propagation environment, we maintain a daily light integral of 10 to 12, that being the average of 11, and air temperature and root zone temperature is 73 degrees Fahrenheit, and relative humidity set point of 80 ended up with 78. And then after 10 days, we did start irrigating the crop or the cuttings with 75 parts per million, 17,417, so a neutral-based fertilizer. So what we found, so we're looking at leucanthemum. On the top left, we have the untreated control, so 0 parts per million IBA. Moving from left to right, we had 200 parts per million KIBA, and then 2 to 1200 parts per million Advocate, and then the days after spray. So I'm going to be focusing on 21 days, and what we found that as we increase Advocate from 200 to 800 parts per million, we had a 123% increase in root dry mass. However, we have deemed that the optimal application rate to be 200 to 400, considering that at 800 parts per million, we had too much phytotoxicity and epinastia or twisting of the leaves. when we compare the 200 parts per million advocate to the KIBA 200 parts per million, there was no significant difference. For Phlox paniculata, we found that there was no difference, statistically no difference from 2 to 1200 parts per million advocate. However, visually there was a difference with the optimum rates being at 2 to 400. And again, when we compare the advocate to the KIBA, there was no significant difference at 21 days. So here's all the other species that I had mentioned earlier. We did see some slight variation, but overall 2 to 400 parts per million advocate is the optimal application rate for the foliar sprays for the species presented here. Given that above 400 parts per million, there was some epinasty or phytotoxicity, but by 21 days that they had not grown out of quite yet. So what was the overall take on these trials is that, like I said, there was slight variation among the 10 herbaceous perennials trialed, and that 2 to 400 parts per million advocate is considered to be the optimal application rate for the 10 species trialed here, and that the 200 parts per million advocate responded similarly to the 200 parts per million KIBA. So what is the take home? It's that to conduct the in-house trials to evaluate rooting and the phytotoxicity, because the cultivars trialed here that I did not provide may vary in terms of the cultivars that you are currently propagating as well. So I'd be more than happy to discuss what cultivars were trialed here through via email as well. But again, just conduct those small in-house trials if you are considering applying foliar IBA applications for the first time. And furthermore, we will be conducting more trials this fall. So shifting gears, I'm going to talk about light now. And that when we talk about light, it's the photosynthetic photon flux, or the instantaneous amount of light that plants receive. And this can vary over the course of time within a given minute, hour, or day, and by location. So wherever you are, for example, in the US, your light intensity will vary. So what is another way to look at that? It is the amount of photons that are falling within a given square meter. We talk about the photosynthetic photon flux more on a scientific basis, but from a greenhouse and propagator standpoint, let's talk about the photosynthetic daily light integral, or the amount of light that plants receive in 24 hours. And this, again, can vary over the course of time. So how do you manipulate the daily light integral? We often employ supplemental lighting from high pressure sodium lamps or HPS lamps and light emitting diodes or LEDs. However, on the flip side, if you're in areas in the United States where you have too much light, you may have to deploy shading to maintain a target daily light integral of 10 to 12 moles per meter square per day, for example. So here's an example of a greenhouse operation using the commercially standard HPS lamps, but also trialing or making that shift into using supplemental LED lighting for day extension as well. So you do see greenhouses sticking with the HPS lamps, but you're also seeing them using LEDs, and there is ongoing research with propagating under LEDs. So here's an example. The figure at the top demonstrates the average outdoor daily light integral during times of the year, January through March, when we're propagating bedding plants, that being annuals or perennials. And as you can see, the average outdoor daily light integral is quite low in the majority of the United States. And this is, like I said, the average outdoor, and the daily light integral can be reduced by up to 50% in the greenhouse due to the glazing material, the infrastructure, the glazing material, or pollen pollution that has landed on the glazing material. And the figure on the bottom demonstrates the benefits of using supplemental lighting. So during January and February, there's a large to moderate benefit of using supplemental lighting. And then once we progress into the spring months, there's a very small to moderate benefit depending on where you are in the United States of using supplemental lighting. Again, this is in general for propagation of bedding plants, but when we look specifically at perennials, they are propagated from early spring to late spring, throughout the summer, and throughout the fall. So herbaceous perennials during propagation are subjected to varying daily light integrals from spring to fall, so that being either low or high. So again, supplemental lighting may need to be utilized versus shading may need to be utilized to maintain that daily light integral. So what are the responses that plants have to daily light integral? Leaf size and thickness is often manipulated by the daily light integral branching. So overall, we typically try to maintain the highest daily light integral in propagation without any negative benefit, without any negative impacts on rooting to produce a compact, well-branched liner. So you can see in this figure of Achillea where I propagated these cuttings under 1.5 moles per meter square per day versus 10, and you can see that these cuttings, under a daily light integral of 10 are well rooted. They have a lot of leaves compared to those that were essentially propagated under shade, under no light almost whatsoever. So as you can see here that there are benefits of using daily light integral or using supplemental lighting. Here's another example with heuchera, how daily light integral from 2.5 all the way to 15 moles per meter square per day influences the number of leaves per cutting, stem caliper, and root dry mass as well. So overall, daily light integral is important in terms of plant growth and producing a high quality liner. So now I'm going to shift gears to root zone temperature. So root zone temperature or basal temperature is critical for callus induction and root initiation. Essentially, how fast can you get the root initials out by using the optimal root zone temperature? Increasing medium temperatures of that root zone temperature will produce or initiate root initiation or formation very quickly, but once you get above that species dependent or optimum temperature, you will see a negative impact on rooting, and I will show an example of that. But if the root zone temperature is too cool, you will see limited to hardly any rooting whatsoever in those cuttings. So here's an example of the Coreopsis lamruck ruby that we utilize in some of our studies looking at callusing. So we subjected these cuttings to a daily light integral of 5.5 and a root zone temperature of 72, 75, 79, and 82 degrees Fahrenheit. And what we found is that the minimum root zone temperature was 75 degrees Fahrenheit for callusing Coreopsis. At 72, we saw very little of the cuttings to be calloused in little as 3 days compared to 5 days. So based off of this work, and again, this research had no IBA foliar or basal depths. This was strictly the effect of root zone temperature on callusing of the species that I have provided here. So we were able to categorize them based off the minimum root zone temperature, 75 degrees, and how quickly they were to callus. So we categorized them as fast, moderate, and slow. From this research, we were then able to determine the interaction between daily light integral and root zone temperature. So here's an example of Pinnacle propagated under various root zone temperatures of 70, 73, 77, and 81 degrees Fahrenheit, and noting the percent rooting, root number, and root dry mass increased up to 73 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit and tailored off. So we did observe that negative impact of using a root zone temperature above that threshold for root initiation and formation for Pinnacle. So I mentioned earlier the interaction of daily light integral and root zone temperature in terms of propagating herbaceous perennials. So a lot of perennials were propagated, and I'm only going to show just a few of them here. And this one, for example, is Gara, where we propagated it under a daily light integral of 1.5, 4, 10, and 15 moles per meter square per day, and at root zone temperatures of 68, 75, and 82 degrees. And these photos were taken at 8 days after transfer. And I'm going to be talking about these specific plants moving forward. So we collected quite a bit of data. I know this looks like a lot in terms of leaf dry mass, stem, and root dry mass, but we're just going to focus on root dry mass for right now and moving forward. Is that what we found is that after days from transfer, so we calloused the cuttings in one greenhouse and then move them into another greenhouse under their respective propagation daily light integral treatments and root zone temperatures with reduced humidity. And what we found from 2 to 14 days is that as propagation daily light integral increased from 1.6 or 1.8 up to 15.4 or 15.3, the root dry mass did increase. However, there was variable responses across root zone temperatures. So when we looked at all the data collectively, we determined that the optimal root zone temperature was 75 degrees Fahrenheit and a propagation daily light integral of 10 moles per meter square per day for propagating Gara. So here's an example of Gaillardia, again, subjected to the same root zone and propagation daily light integral treatments. They were calloused for 8 days and rooted for 14 days, so for a total of 22 days of propagation. And what we found is that the daily light integral of 10 and root zone temperature of 75 produced the most marketable rooted liner for Gaillardia Gallo Red. So the take home for this, for rooting or propagating herbaceous perennials, is to maintain a target daily light integral of 10 moles per meter square per day and a root zone temperature of 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Going above 10 moles per meter square per day to 12 or 15 may have some more benefits, but again, we didn't see any detrimental impact in terms of root development. This research has been published in Grower Talks, I believe, in 2017. So for more information on that, you can refer back to these articles or you can send me an email as well. So with that, I'm going to thank all our supporters in terms of this research, and I will gladly entertain any questions that you may have.
All right. We do not have any questions coming in for you, Garrett, but we'll give people a chance to think about it. Go ahead and type them in if you can. Let's see. Let's get mine up. Paul, if you want to come back while we wait, we've got a question for you, although both of you can feel free to weigh in on this one. And that is from Zane, wants to know, how do you control root rot during heavy rainy periods? What are some tips about that, besides sticking everything in a greenhouse?
Yeah, cover it. Avoid those rainy periods. Trying to have a growing mix. Yeah, move to a different place. Try to have a growing mix with a lot of drainage or aeration porosity in it. So when you have those conditions that the water, instead of holding in the soil particles, that they're allowed to be released and provide drainage. That's, the quicker you can get air back into that soil, the less apt you're going to be to have a root rot problem.
How about preventative chemical applications?
I'm going to say the chemicals, yes. I'm not going to say don't do them, but think of the chemicals as a Band-Aid in that scenario. The problem is the rain and the wet conditions around the root, standing water maybe. And so a fungicide will kill some of the pathogens that are there, might delay the inevitable. Maybe it'll buy enough time, but the problem is the water.
Gotcha. All right. Jan wants to know, propagating dianthus, the procedure. That could be a whole webinar unto itself. But Garrett, you want to tackle that and maybe hit it with some bullet points?
Yeah, so unfortunately, specifically for dianthus, I have not conducted any of the trials during my PhD or here recently, but for the rooting hormone for dianthus, that is one of the species that has made the list to be investigated this fall. Paul, do you have any suggestions for propagating dianthus?
Yeah, well, as far as the rooting hormone, I guess the literature, says that there's a benefit for using some NAA in combination with the IBA. So doing a dual rooting compound. Otherwise, dianthus, it's one of those where you don't ever want that soil to dry out around the cutting. So if that soil does get bone dry or dries down too far, that cutting will sit there. It'll be alive, but it'll sit there and not generate callus or roots. And then, so I guess in the beginning, you're going to treat it much like a regular cutting as far as your mist interval. But 2 or 3 days in, you can already start backing off and treating it kind of like a silver plant with reducing the mist by maybe about 50% of what you're doing to other crops.
All right. Speaking of mist, we've got a question about mist from Marilyn. And this question's for Garrett. Again, both of you can weigh in. As a small grower, we have many different types of perennials rooting at the same time. When it comes to mist, should we err on having more or less? Interesting question. We'll keep it on the wet side or the dry side?
So in general, when sticking cuttings, you want to irrigate in your propagation flats. So essentially, that's the only moisture that the plants are going to receive, because mist is only used to keep the plants turgid. So in general, you want to try to maintain the cuttings to be turgid. So some misting controllers have a light sensor or electronic leaf. So when so much water lands on that electronic leaf, it will stop the mist, and then over time with the sun or evaporation of that water, that leaf will rise up, and then a misting event will occur. But in general, you want to not keep the keep the cuttings saturated, but you don't want to keep them too dry, because again, you are wanting to promote that root development and keep that plant turgid and not stressed whatsoever.
All right. Are there any situations where you definitely want to separate different varieties because their mist needs in propagation could be so diverse that you really wouldn't want those two crops side by side under the same mist? Paul, you're nodding.
Well, yeah, and I have a comment to go back to for Garrett's question too. But yeah, I would group them by mist requirement. Probably just 2 groups: average mist and maybe a low mist, like your silver plants, succulents, and silver leaf perennials tend to require a lot less mist than the rest. Comment on the humidity question or the misting question is, I find it's to keep that humidity up above the soil is what we need. So the smaller the nozzle size, the better, and to run that as frequently as I guess the system will allow. Garrett said we really don't need the free moisture in the soil or the plant itself. So we want to maintain high humidity. And so if we did with a smaller droplet size, you're going to get, it's going to evaporate and go into the environment and create humidity there. So small particle size, and then mist appropriately.
All right. You want to add to that, Garrett?
I think Paul answered it the way that I would. Sorry, I was typing another answer as well. I was listening though.
No, that's okay. We got a couple more questions here. Sonia wants to know, and this is for you, Garrett. Pay attention here.
Okay.
For perennial cuttings, are PGRs used to increase the number of potential cuttings a perennial can produce? In other words, can you bulk up your stock using PGRs? I think that's what she's implying.
Depends on the type of plant growth regulator or retardant that's used. So for example, benzoyladinine will cause branching, but also ethafon will also cause some branching. So from those branches, you can excise the apical meristem if the plant is not patented.
Is Florel one of those?
Florel is at the font. That's
thinking.
correct.
Okay.
Yep. Or collate.
Gotcha. All right. Jim wants to know thoughts on tenting using like a remay fabric of dianthus URCs in the early days of propagation. He says he loves that technique. Are you going to shoot him down and tell him it's no good?
No, tenting can be quite effective, and it's a good strategy. One thing with tenting is, dianthus, we can leave it on for a little bit longer, but many plants, we only can leave it on maybe for 5, 6, 7 days. Otherwise, we'll get some melting out of the cuttings under the tent. So think of the tent kind of as an acclimation tool. It's coming from Central or South America, like Garrett said. It's been in a box, and now we're throwing it in a hot greenhouse, maybe with lower than desirable humidity levels. So the tenting creates a micro environment around the cutting, but it's not necessary to keep that micro environment for very long extended periods of time. But I do know growers who propagate under tents quite successfully, but it's how they're managed.
Yep. So I likely failed to mention that the foliar rooting hormone study that was conducted this spring was under a humidity tent. And then after about 7 days, slits in the plastic were cut to remove some of the excess heat that was built up as well. But yes, it was to keep the cuttings turgid when I didn't have the appropriate humidity apparatus to keep the environment humid.
All right. And last question, unless any more pop in while we're working on this one. If an unrooted cutting, a URC, wilts severely in the early days of propagation, what's the best practice that you can advise to help it recover as quickly as possible? Understanding that, of course, it depends on the species.
I would consider looking at the environmental controls, how much light that plant is receiving, and then look at the misting frequency. Sometimes mist is used to cool off cuttings if they get too hot, if too high of temperatures are reached or the light intensity is just too high. So look at the environmental controls, or if you have or if it's just in a poly house, you may want to add a little bit more shade to it just to acclimate that cutting to get it back into being turgid again.
All right. Paul, any last thoughts on that?
Yeah, in the days after the wilt, yes, it's about stress management, taking the stress off the cutting, shade, water management, but don't over mist. It doesn't necessarily need 3 times the amount of water because it wilted once. A wetting agent, maybe putting a capsule or suffusion on at that time just to help maintain the humidity and moisture on the cutting itself could be a tool. And then there was also the work several years ago with using pageant, but that was prior, that was like after sticking, but prior to you have a stress event. So using pageant can, decrease the likelihood of the plant from wilting, as well as it will recover faster from the wilt. But that would have to be before the stress event occurred.
All right. Oh, we had one more question come in, Garrett, on PGRs. Let's see. Which form of PGR is more productive for cuttings? A solution, a powder, or a gel? And how many times would you dip the cuttings normally? I don't know if we're talking PGRs or rooting hormones in this case.
I think to answer this question appropriately, I'm going to lean more towards discussing a rooting hormone. And like I had mentioned in the presentation, I would conduct a small in-house trial with different rooting hormones that you could receive on the species that you plan to propagate, and see what form of rooting hormone and the concentration of that rooting hormone will work best for you.
All right. Well, great. We're going to wrap it up right there. If you have other questions during the webinar, both of our guest experts put up their contact information. Unfortunately, I don't have one last slide where I can give it to you. However, you'll be able to rewatch this session. You can forward fast through it. I'll share my screen real quickly so you can get the address. There it is, darwinperennials.com/digital days. The powers that be at Darwin Perennials will get it up as quickly as possible so you can rewatch it, get the information you need, a few more tips, share it with your friends or colleagues or what have you. And I want to give one more thanks to the Digital Day sponsor, Ball Seed, for making this possible. And that's pretty much it for day 3 of Darwin Days. Of course, go to the website, check out some of those videos. They're fun, they're informative. Be sure to tune in tomorrow and Friday for everything else that'll be going on at Darwin Digital Days. I would say mark your calendar for next year. We don't know the date. It's usually right around, I think, the 3rd Wednesday in June, if I'm not mistaken, where Lord willing and the creek don't rise, as they say, we'll be able to do this there in the gardens. So, but with that, I want to thank Garrett and Paul for helping us out. And I want to say on behalf of everybody at Darwin and all of my staff at Ball Publishing who work hard so I don't have to, I'm Chris Beatty saying, so long, everybody.